We're going to be in Matthew chapter 20, if you want to turn there. Matthew chapter 20. When do you suppose was the first time you ever uttered the words, "That's not fair"? Now you notice I don't ask you if you've ever said them, because I'm just operating on the assumption that you've all uttered those words. I'm just asking, when do you suppose the first time was? When it was about 3? Probably when mom was like divvying up the portions for dinner, and you notice that your brother got a bigger piece of chicken or an extra piece of pizza or a bigger piece of cake. That's not fair! Maybe when you're at school at 4 or 5 or 6 and you're playing a game out at recess and some kid cheats the system somehow, or no tag backs, that's not fair, or how'd he manage to do, and we didn't win and it's just not fair. What about recently? You utter the words recently? When somebody gets ahead and you think they didn't actually earn the advantage? One of the adult versions, one of the ones I hear all the time is, well, that's not my job, I shouldn't have to do that. They made the mess, why do I have to clean up after them? They're supposed to be responsible for that. Why am I here doing their job for them? It's not fair. They don't pay me enough to do that. It's not fair. We have this deep, innate sense of fairness. Now, the problem is, what we normally mean when we say that's not fair is, that didn't work out well for me. We actually have no concept of what's actually right and wrong. Our worldview is so distorted that it usually is only about what we think is good for us. And so when they're mean to a public figure we like, we say that's not fair. When they pass a law that affects us negatively, we say that's not fair. When we don't get a raise at work that we think we deserve, we say that's not fair. What we really mean is, don't I deserve better? Haven't I earned more than what I got? And I just want to tell you, in Matthew 20 today, we're going to read this story. And if you have a sense of what is fair, of things needing to be right, this story is downright offensive. It will offend your sense of fairness. In fact, John MacArthur writes, this is a story about what happens when God's grace trumps human fairness. But it's a story that is intended to challenge you. You know, we've been singing this word the song at closing called Ancient Words, changing me, changing you. This is a story that Jesus told with the intention of changing your perspective about how the world works, of speaking to your heart and making it different than its normal status. So my challenge to you this morning as we walk through this is, go ahead and be offended. Go ahead and be honest with yourself and let it speak to your biases. That through the power of the story that Jesus told 2,000 years ago, we might come to a better understanding of what it means to live by grace. That these ancient words might change who we are. So we're going to start at the very beginning of Matthew chapter 20, and we're just going to walk bit by bit through it. We'll read a few verses, and then we'll stop and chat about them. Matthew 20, starting in verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the workers on 1 denarius for the day, he sent them to his vineyard. Okay, there's a lot of context here that I want to give you so we can picture the scene. In ancient Israel, there were plains and there were mountains. The valleys or the plains is where you planted wheat or barley. The mountains are where you planted olives and grapes in your vineyard. They'd build these wooden trellises to kind of level it out. They'd haul topsoil up and they would plant these massive vineyards on the mountain. Now, the typical operation of such a vineyard would require only 1 or 2 sets of hands. Okay? After the season was planted, the weeding, the keeping pests off, the maintaining would not require a lot of work. But when harvest season came, you would need several sets of hands to accomplish the goal. So like when you plant wheat can be ripe for weeks or months before you harvest it. If you have a big field of wheat, you can do a little bit today and a little bit tomorrow and a little bit next week. Wheat doesn't go bad on the stalk very often. Same thing with a crop like corn, or we plant potatoes in our garden. You can pick potatoes anywhere from like the first week of August to the first week of November without any problem. But grapes, see, when grapes become ripe, you have just a few days, maybe a couple of weeks to pick, clean, and process the grapes. or they will go bad hanging on the vine. So the picture here is of a man who owns a large vineyard, who probably has a couple of full-time workers, but it is now harvest season. And in order to get all of the grapes off the vine, cleaned, and turned into juice, which will eventually become wine, he needs to hire some extra help for the few days. He's looking for day laborers. We still have day labor in our culture today, right? If you've ever been a substitute teacher, you're a glorified day laborer. They call you and say, could you be at the kindergarten class tomorrow at 8 o'clock, and we need you to work tomorrow. Doesn't mean you're going to have work on Tuesday or Wednesday. You're going to get paid a set fee for tomorrow's work. Okay? We have temp people who work for temp agencies, and they go in and they might be answering the phone at a chemical plant one day and filing paperwork at a dentist office the next day and, scrubbing carpets somewhere the next day. They're working wherever the work is. But even in blue-collar fields, we have day laborers. Not so much around here, but if you go to a bigger city. I remember being on a mission trip to Pittsburgh several years ago, and we were doing inner-city work. We were building fences and cleaning up vacant lots and all that kind of stuff. And we went to Home Depot one day to buy supplies for this fence we were building. And sitting outside the lumber yard of Home Depot were like 15 or 20 guys, ranging from like 14 to probably 60s and 70s, every ethnic group you can imagine. And I asked our mission trip leader, I said, what are they doing? And he said, they're hoping somebody will hire them. Because what would happen is a contractor who maybe had a demolition job would pull in and go, hey, I need 3 guys today. I'll pay you $80 for the day if you'll come help me tear down this wall we're tearing down. Or, hey, I'm spreading mulch or digging ditches today. I need 2 guys with strong backs. Hop in, I'll pay you a blank amount of money for the day. So they would gather at Home Depot hoping that some contractor or some landscaper would hire them for the day. And it was really simple. If they didn't work, they probably didn't eat that day. If no one hired them, they went home hungry. For whatever reason, they couldn't hold down a full-time job. My guy said many of them had a criminal background and couldn't get hired anywhere. And so their only hope to take care of their family was that someone would hire them for the day. And so this landowner walks into the city square and sees this group of guys gathered, all of them hoping to work. And the first group he hires at 6 o'clock in the morning, they're the cream of the crop. They're the guys with the most experience and the best workers. You pick the best guys because you're there early. I'm going to hire them for the whole day. And he agrees to pay them a single denarius for a day's work. Now, a denarius, we know from historical records, was appropriate wages for a day of skilled labor. So if you're Joseph and you're a carpenter by trade, you build things, you would expect to make a denarius a day. If you're the Apostle Paul and you're a craftsman and you're making tents for people that they're buying for the marketplace or to live in, you could expect to make about a denarius a day. But for grunt labor, for manual, blue-collar, unskilled grunt labor, a denarius is a generous offer. The reason we see no negotiating here, the reason no one's bartering with him saying, well, how about a denarius and a half? How about, is because they know, and everyone hearing Jesus tell this story instinctually knows those guys are not getting a better offer. This is the most generous offer they're going to get all day. A denarius for a day of unskilled manual labor is an incredibly generous payday. And so they follow the man into the vineyard. They're excited. They're eager. They know it's going to be a good day. Picking up in verse 3. When we're talking about the landowner here, when he went out about 9 in the morning, he saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. To those men he said, you also go to my vineyard, and I will give you whatever is right. So off they went. About noon, and again at 3, he went out again and did the same thing. Then about 5, he went out and found others standing around and said to them, why have you been standing here all day doing nothing? Because no one hired us, they said to him. You also go to my vineyard, he told them. So here's the scene. Either because he figured the work wasn't going to get done, or simply because he was gracious. And based on the point of the parable, I'm going to argue it's because he was gracious. The landowner is traveling through town again, and he sees that at 9 o'clock, 3 hours after the workday begins, there are still men with nothing to do. And so he says to a group of them, hey, go work in my vineyard. And he comes back around noon on his lunch break and he sees that there are still guys who've yet to be hired. No one has pulled up and said, hey, I have work for you today. And by this point, the workers are beginning to grow desperate because if they aren't hired, they don't get to eat for the day. So he says to them, you guys also go work in my vineyard. He does the same thing at 3 in the afternoon. You also go work in my vineyard. By the time we get to 5 p.m., the guys that are left are desperate. No one has hired them. They're the bottom of the barrel. No one wants to choose them. They only get to work on the most busy of days because if they were any good at their job, they would already be working somewhere. And so here are these stragglers. And he says to them, why aren't you doing anything? And they say, because nobody wants us. No one's hired us. If someone would offer me a job, I would be there in a heartbeat. But nobody wanted us, so we're just standing here. And he says to them, you also go work in my vineyard. Now, what you'll notice is absent from these encounters is there is no mention of a price. There is no mention of what the landowner is willing or interested in paying. To those he hires at 9 and at noon and at 3, he simply says, I will pay you what is right. And those workers, because they are desperate for anything, are like, okay, we'll just trust that this guy's a good man and he'll take care of us. But they don't negotiate, they don't agree on any price. To those he hires at 5, he doesn't even mention paying them. He doesn't say anything about, I'll give you anything. He just says, go work in my vineyard. And they are just hoping that whatever thing he might offer them at the end of the day is better than nothing. I've been here all day, 11 hours waiting, and nobody wanted me and nobody hired me. Whatever this guy gives me will be better than going home empty-handed. Maybe he'll offer me a handful of grapes to take home for my family. Maybe he'll just say, hey, you can come back tomorrow. Whatever I get out of this is better than nothing. They are utterly desperate. And so they agree to go. And then Jesus, as he often does in his parables, presents the twist. Here we are in verse 8. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard told his foreman, call the workers and give them their pay, starting with the last and ending with the first. When those who were hired about 5 came, they each received 1 denarius. And so when the first ones came, they assumed they would get more, but they also received a denarius each. When they received it, they began to complain to the landowner. These men put in 1 hour, and you made them equal to us who bore the burden of the day and the burning heat. So here's the twist in the story. When 6 p.m. arrives and the workday is over, Jesus, or the landowner who portrays Jesus in this instance, the landowner has them all line up. He says, bring me those who came last and put them at the front of the line. Bring those who were here all day and put them at the back. And he gives to those who've only worked an hour a full day's pay. An incredibly generous amount of money. They've worked an hour, and probably the easiest hour of the day. They missed all the afternoon heat. They missed all of the hard labor. They were there just for the tail end. It's kind of like being a senior minister. You show up when all the manual labor is done, right? You guys set up all the tail. Oh, looks good. I've been working on that skill. In youth ministry, they make you do all the work. So I had to learn how to do it. They show up for an hour, and they get the same pay you would pay a carpenter for a full day's labor. It is extravagant and ridiculous. And those hearing Jesus' story for the first time would have laughed at this. No one would ever pay that much money for that little work. And though they're not included in the story, you can picture the guys who've been there for 3 hours going, wow, if they got that, I wonder what I'm going to get. And the guys behind them in line who've been there for 6 hours and 9 hours and all day immediately think, if he gave that generous of a gift to them, what must he have in store for us? But then those who've been there for 3 hours come up to get paid, and they get the same denarius. And those who've been there half a day, they get the same denarius. Those who've been there 9, they get the same denarius. Those who've been there all day, they get the same denarius. And their immediate response is, that's not fair. How could you do that? And I want to make a key distinction here, because they're not upset that they have been treated unfairly. They got what they agreed to get. In fact, they got a generous amount of a payday. And so they're not upset. They don't accuse the landowner of, you ripped us off, you weren't fair to us, you didn't treat us well. Their complaint is this. Let's read it again. It's here in verse 12. These last men put in only 1 hour, and you made them equal to us. Their complaint is not that they were treated poorly, but that those who came so late were treated so well. They're angry because the master was generous with someone else. I want to just modernize the story real quick so you can appreciate in real terms the outrage of this story and why I say it's an offensive story. And so let's for a moment pretend you're sitting outside the lumber yard at Home Depot, and a guy pulls up looking for folks to work for the day. And he says, listen, we're going to landscape the entire campus of the University of Akron today. I got 12 dump trucks full of mulch. We're going to mulch the whole campus today. I know it's hot. I know it's going to be a long day. $300 for a day's work. Now, I don't know if you've done math before, but $300 for a 12-hour day for manual labor, that's a really good pay. That's roughly $30 an hour once you take the taxes out of it, okay? 30 times 12 is $360 tax, okay? So $30 an hour to shovel mulch. You're not going to find a better payday than that. And the folks sitting there, you're sitting there, and you know that you depend on this pay to take care of your family. And your first thought is, that is so much money, I may not have to work tomorrow. Even if I don't find work for the rest of the week, that's enough money for me to feed my family till Friday. I can survive a whole week. This is the best day of my life. He is so, seriously, if you're living check to check, day to day, and someone offers you enough money to cover multiple days' work, that is a moment of joy. And so all day you're thinking, I can't wait to go home and tell my wife how much I made. I can't wait to go home and show we're going to buy the fancy cheeseburgers tonight. We're going to Freddy's instead of McDonald's. It's going to be awesome. And so you're shoveling mulch thinking, man, this is awesome. I want to work for this guy again. He is so kind. And out of the corner of your eye, you notice that every few hours, another truckload of folks pull up. And you're not paying that much attention, but you're like, oh, it's 8 or 9, some guys are coming late. And at your lunch break, you see another truck pull up, and mid-afternoon, another. And then you notice that, like, you're doing the last building. And this truck pulls up with guys, and they do like 2 wheelbarrows of mulch, and they're done. Like, they work for 25 minutes, and they're all done. They were leaning on their shovel, telling Joe, they did some work, but not much. And so when the payday comes, and you're all lined up, and you see the boss with this stack of $100 bills. And he hands the guy at the front of the line, who just showed up an hour ago, $300. Are you not in the back of the line thinking to yourself, man, I can't wait to see what I get? I mean, I knew this guy was generous, but this is crazy. I bet I'm getting like $800. I bet he's giving me $1,000. I've been here all day. If he gave that guy $300, what's he going to give to me? Surely I have earned something more. Surely I'm worth more than that guy who barely did any work. And so you can picture the outrage when, after you have sweated and hurt, and your face is sunburnt, and your back is sore, and your hands have blisters on them, you get the same pay as the guy who just showed up. You'd be furious. You, like the folks in the story, would go, that's not fair. And the master has a simple response. Verse 11. He, again the landowner, replies to one of them, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Didn't you agree with me on a denarius? Take what's yours and go. I want to give the last man the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my business? Are you jealous because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. In essence, the master's response is, it's my money, and I will be generous with who I want to be generous with. I was generous with you, and I'm going to be generous with him. Why are you upset that someone else is being blessed? It's my stuff. I will be generous with whom I desire. Now, this story can be applied in about a dozen different ways. When it was originally spoken, when Jesus was teaching the crowds in 32, 33 AD. Here's what I guarantee you the people in the crowd heard. They heard the story in the context of the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin, versus the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the adulterers that Jesus hung out with. Its closest cousin in Scripture is the story of the prodigal son, in which the older brother, who has been a responsible, faithful worker, doesn't understand why the younger brother gets all of this extravagant love and grace and celebration. He says, I've been here working for you. Don't I deserve more than this guy who just showed back up? They are parallel stories. And so what the Pharisees were saying, in essence, when they talked to Jesus, they play the role of the early workers in this story. Jesus, I've been keeping the law since I was a little kid. Look how long my prayer tassel is. I give 1/10 of everything at the temple. I can quote the entire book of Deuteronomy from memory. I go to temple every day for prayers. I make all of the sacrifices. I've never missed a single Sabbath celebration at the temple or the synagogue. Doesn't all of my hard work, doesn't all of my obedience to the law earn me something? Don't I deserve better than this tax collector who betrayed our people, who's been living in sin, and all of a sudden you're just going to show him grace? Don't I deserve better than him? Aren't I better than him? And the resounding answer of the story is, not even a little bit. It doesn't earn you anything, because it's all grace anyway. The master chose all of them. None of them deserved the work. None of them deserved the pay. None of them were somehow special. All of them were chosen by the landowner, put to work, and paid generously. It's all grace anyway. So no, your holy living, following the law, earns you nothing special, because it's all grace anyway. When this story was first written down by Matthew and recorded in the gospel, we're probably in the mid to late 60s. Sometime between 65 and 75 AD. And at that time, I can almost guarantee you that the early church read it in light of the battle between Jews and Gentiles. Matthew, after all, is a gospel written to Jewish Christians primarily. And for them, there are these Jews going, wait a minute, we're God's chosen people. We've had the law for 2,000 years. We're descendants of Abraham. We've been circumcised. We've been keeping the Sabbath holy for 2,000 years. We haven't had bacon in 2,000 years. We've been making sacrifices. We've been keeping the law. And now what you're telling me is that this Gentile guy, just last week, he was down at the temple of Diana committing idolatry. Do you know how much sexual immorality there is in those pagan worship festivals? You know how much drunkenness there is in those pagan worship festivals? So you're telling me that me, a God-fearing Jew, descended from God-fearing Jews, all the work we've put in, all the holy living we've done, all the law-keeping we've done, doesn't that make us better than those pagans? And the answer of the story is a resounding, not even a little bit. Because it's all grace anyway. And so what about for us? What are your prejudices? You'll notice again, I didn't ask you if you have any. I asked you what they were. For some people, it's still racial. They see people of a different ethnicity, and they immediately assume things about them. They must be gangsters. They must be murderers. They must be terrorists. They must be, and we have these prejudices. Surely God couldn't love them as much as He loves me. For some people, it's classism. You see a poor guy on the street asking for food, and you think, well, why doesn't he work for something? Why didn't he get a job? After all I've worked for to build my life, why should I have to help him? You don't know his story. Listen, Candace and I have been sitting in these classes. We're in the process of moving into the adoption phase with our kids. You have no concept of how hurt some people have been. There's this survey called the ACEs survey, which I am completely unfamiliar with until we took it in class. And they list these different traumas that kids face. you have a parent die before you were 15? Did you go through a divorce? Did you witness domestic abuse? Were you sexually abused? Were you neglected and abandoned? And there's this whole list of them. I scored a big whopping 0. I had as good of a childhood as you could hope for. My parents loved each other, and they loved me, and they took me to church, and we didn't have, I big whopping 0. There are folks in our class who are 7, 8, 9 of these traumatic things before they were 10, 11 years old. You meet people on the street all the day, all the time, carrying so much baggage, and you look at them and you think, man, get your life together. Look at me, look how hard I work, look at how much. Where would you be if you were beaten to a pulp when you were 3? Where would you be if the people you trusted most sexually abused you? Would you be where you are? Where would you be if your dad said, I hated you, and left and never came back? Of course they've got baggage. And who are we to say, well, get your act together, it's all grace anyway. The fact that you had the parents you have, and the house you live in, and the work ethic you have, and the health you have, and the ability to work, and the intelligence to do the job, and the friends to support you, it's all grace anyway. You didn't earn that. It's all grace. Maybe it's not classism. Maybe for you it's certain sins. You look at someone living in sexual immorality and you say, well, they could never be a Christian if they live like that. Or you look at someone who's struggling with addiction and you think, man, how could they ever make those choices? God could never do anything with someone like that. Or even something as shallow. I had a friend who, she grew up at our church, and when she went to college, she went to visit this other church. She was looking for someplace closer to campus. And her very first Sunday, someone said to her, not kidding, hey, you might want to wear long sleeves from now on so you can cover up your tattoos when you come to church. Never mind that the tattoos on her arm say, shine like the stars in the universe and agape. We have these inner prejudices where we think, well, you couldn't actually be a Christian and do that. Or God couldn't use you if you're like that. Or God doesn't love. And really what we're saying is, doesn't all of my time going to church, doesn't all the good deeds I've done, all my time serving as a leader, all my time in paid ministry, all the sermons that I've preached, all the hospital visits I've made, doesn't all the good stuff I've done earn me something? And the resounding answer is, not even a little bit. Because through grace, I have received a relationship with Jesus Christ. What else is there? What else is there? I've already received the fullness of everything God has to offer. What exactly am I supposed to be earning? And so our jealousy really comes from not, I want more, but shouldn't they get less because they're not as good as me? And folks, that is not how grace works. Grace at its core is the recognition that we deserve nothing but the fullness of the wrath of God. And instead, through the work of Jesus Christ, we receive eternity with Him. And it's for anyone who wants it. And all of our works and all of our good deeds we do because we've received His grace, not in order to earn something better. And sometimes we forget that. So if I could just plead with you before we close this morning, can we stop with all the judgment among ourselves to other Christians, online to people who think differently or vote differently from us? In our neighborhoods, over coffee today? Can we just stop? Can we stop with all the condemning and all the I'm better than them and I can't believe they do that? Can we just stop and recognize that we're all in the same boat? You, me, and everyone else. One writer wrote a long time ago, and I couldn't find the quote, but it stuck with me, so I'm going to share it anyway. He says, one of the blackest parts of the Christian's heart is that we tend to want grace for ourselves and justice for everyone else. We want God to treat them badly because of their sin. We want God to treat them poorly because they're not like us. We want God to punish them, but we want grace for us. Can we just stop? as the people of God in this church, can we just say from this point forward, we are going to treat people with the same love and grace that God has treated us? And we are going to recognize that I am no better than them. My skin doesn't make me better. My work at the church doesn't make me better. My class doesn't make me better. How I sin versus how they sin doesn't make me better. We're all in the same boat. We've been singing about it. Carlene read the scripture this morning. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It makes no difference. We're all sinners in need of grace. And can we as the people of God just bask in his grace instead of making about what we've earned or deserved? So we're going to do that for closing song this morning for invitation. We're going to sing a song about the beautiful nature of God's grace. If you've never experienced that for yourself, we invite you to come as we sing. I would love to explain what grace means for you. And for the rest of us, may we take this moment and just bask in the simple truth that it's all grace anyway. And God has been so, so kind to us. Why don't you stand as we sing together?